Hey everyone, I'm Marissa Evangelista. I'm a gallery assistant with the Maryland Federation of Art, and I am here to introduce our guest, Esperanza Alzona. Esperanza's sculpture embody various emotions and sensations through the facial and body expressions that are conveyed. Her work being mostly composed of metal also adds to the emotional weight that is expressed in her pieces and gives them a very strong presence no matter the scale of her dynamic work. We are so grateful to have her work included in Interwoven Worlds and to have this opportunity to learn more about her artwork, and her processes. I would also like to briefly introduce our host, Will Scott. He is an art historian who bridges the gap between artists and the public. All right, thank you both.
All right. Thank you, Marissa, for your continued technical support and for that nice introduction to both of us. Well, Esperanza, it's really exciting for me to be able to talk to you this afternoon, this evening. I've had the chance to speak with you briefly a couple of times in the exhibits and on the phone. And of course, your work has been in other of our exhibitions, but this is a very important exhibition to the MFA because it is a deliberate attempt to engage more artists who have cross-cultural backgrounds. And it's part of our goal to increase the diversity of our member artists, our exhibiting artists, and our viewing public. So your work is, to me, especially strong and dynamic. And just reading your bio makes me wonder how you have the time to have accomplished so many things in so many different fields. So thank you for sitting down with us tonight. This is one of the works in the exhibition. And Esperanza, why don't you just briefly describe for us its medium and its size, and then I have a few questions I'd like to ask you about the piece. Okay?
Okay, it's cast aluminum, and I used a life casting process. So that is my face and my hands, and the
Oh,
piece is called Facial Identity. Um, and I cast the pieces in metal and then put them on the marble base. Yeah, and it's about well, the theme of Interwoven Worlds was about our multicultural experience or our experience. And I was born and raised in the US, but my parents are Filipino. And I also come from an era um, that I guess things weren't as quite as integrated as they are now, or other races accepted as much. So, in the early 60s, I as a child, I'd be called, I'd be teased Ching Chong Chinaman,
uh-huh.
Japanese Beetle. I'd be called Gook, and harassed and things like that. And it's just basically because I had a different face.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so it is about, basically tolerating this kind of prejudice growing up.
It is, I think that sort of tension, anxiety, um, uh, searching aspect is very well conveyed in what is a quite small piece. But before we delve into that more substantive part of your work, why aluminum rather than bronze? It's a, to me, as an art historian, it's a fairly conventional use of metal in combination with the stone base, but the aluminum is something that has not been, for a long period, part of more traditional sculptural practice. So why aluminum?
Oh, well, I like working with aluminum. It's a softer metal. It's a little bit more forgiving. It's easier to work with, to finish. And I had the aluminum available. Also, yeah,
You have to be practical too, right?
right. And besides that, it worked well with, the marble base that I have there, which is also, it's sort of gray and white, and it
Mhm.
is also kind of, color wise mixes
Yes.
in.
Yeah, it's
Um,
harmonious.
right.
Uh, Even the contrast, it's hard to see in a small image like this, but in its presence in front of the piece, the difference in textures, the reflective, smooth, glistening surface of the model of the marble, and then the rougher surface of the hands and head are very subtly collaborative to one another. Um, why your own face, although I think what you just said makes it easy to understand why you chose your own face and
Mhm.
hands. But those are two of the oldest subjects in Western and even to some extent non-Western and certainly African sculpture over centuries and eons. So is this a purely personal decision to express yourself in this way, or are you reflecting on the traditions of the art of sculpture?
Um, it is a personal expression, and it just sort of fits in with the theme because it's just the face. So it's almost like holding up a mask of
Hmm.
is representational of who I am. And yes, I mean, we express ourselves, mostly of what we see is your face. It's the first thing
Hmm.
people see,
Hmm.
that they remember when they think about your identity, they think about your face, they don't
Right,
think about your big toe or, so that is it. And that is also why I called it facial identity, because
right,
the first thing that people see usually of a person or remember is their face. It's what represents them. It's they're identified by their face, and you're identified by your hands, like your fingerprints. I mean,
right.
so again, and hands are used very expressively, as you mentioned. So when I created the piece, it was really a personal statement, um, that when I saw the call, that
Hmm.
I was working on that. So.
Yes, yes. Well, I think you really you realized that theme and that emotional state that you've just discussed. Um, As an art historian, I often find it difficult to restrain myself from thinking of connections between contemporary artists' work and artists of the past. I had actually made a little note to myself about a couple of recognized sculptures in the so-called pantheon of Western art that I wanted to ask you about. But as you spoke, you've actually reminded me of an early 20th century printmaker and graphic artist who also concentrated on her face and her gestures very much in her art. And that's Katie Kollwitz. Are you familiar with her work?
Yes, she's German, I think.
Yeah, I can't remember it even. I apologize to my art history professors. I can't remember whether she was German, but she's from the Germanic world.
I,
Yes.
I I think I saw one of her pieces. I believe it was at the Minneapolis Museum of Art, and it was called Lamentation, which
Yes.
is
Oh, yes. That's her
it,
signature work. That's the iconic Katie Kollwitz piece. The reason I ask is not to test your knowledge of the history of art, but rather to ask if in your work you are familiar with those kinds of iconic artists, and does it affect your practice today in the studio?
no, and it's interesting because I did a piece that amazingly was very similar to her piece, and I called it Grief, and
Yes.
was not it had I had never even heard of her, or seen that work before I created this piece. And basically, I had taken a photograph, I had done like a selfie, with my hand over my face, like that piece. And I did a cast iron scratch block, um, you know, out of that. But it was my face and it was my, and like I said, I
Yes.
took a selfie and then I scratched that into a sand mold and cast that. And I created that piece before I ever saw her piece or even heard of her.
Well, I think,
It's just
I don't
coincidence.
mean to interrupt you. Please finish what you were going to say.
Yeah, no, it was just coincidental that, you know, timeless. So I guess that's just, I don't know.
Well, I think I do think I know, or at least I know what I think about it and want to say about it, and that is that I think that significant, thoughtful, and insightful art is really timeless. And this is one of those instances where I get to say about one of our artists participating in our shows that it really is a timeless and international art. And it's not, in my experience, at all unusual, including my experience as a photographer, that these life experiences in the hands of an artist of some talent do tend to repeat themselves because they're universal human experiences. It doesn't matter what century, it doesn't matter what culture you're a part of. And I do think that, at least for me, it makes your creations even more impressive that you've been able to touch on that sort of eternal and international, intergenerational human experience. But if we could, the next thing I'd like to do is briefly look at the other piece that you have in the show. And I should say for listeners that today, because the MFA has been successful in getting so many really fine artists to take an interest in participation in our shows, it has become more and more unusual that a single artist gets more than one piece in a show. So just wanted to share that with the audience and with you, Esperanza, because I think it's another uh, feather in your cap, so to speak, that you've impressed a number of jurors so well. You certainly are impressing me. So talk a little bit about this piece and in the same way, the medium and what you're hoping to express.
Right. Okay. Well, uh, as was mentioned earlier, and in my artist statement, I primarily work in metal, and a lot of cast metal mostly. And stone is a new medium for me. And this is actually the first piece I've ever carved in stone. Um,
Oh,
I came to sculpture because I worked at Shepherd University, and I'm retired and emeritus, but I continue to take courses because I believe in lifelong learning and I'm always learning new techniques. So how I got into metal sculpture was because when I started taking sculpture courses, that is what the professor, that was the thing. And he's since left Shepherd, and I was taking a course, I just keep repeating the courses, and it's a different professor, and we learned how to sculpt in stone. So this is my first time working in stone. Um, and uh, and again, it's called solitude. And again, it expresses the same idea of, being different, um, being a minority, being, that kind of isolation, um, that you're just different. You're often ostracized, or at least that was my experience. I mean, again, nowadays a little bit less so, although I don't know in the climate of today's, the way things are going, whether we're stepping backwards or forwards. But yes, this is kind of expresses what that feeling of just, being different. And Yeah,
Well,
that's
I think you've done that in a very powerful but um, compact way, and to some degree, I think that that makes the force of your expression greater because it is so compact, but it's still, I think, is filled with this kind of tension and force. And not to make this into a political or discussion, I certainly see repeatedly today in the media that people with backgrounds such as yours are again being singled out and oppressed in this way. So it is a very timely piece as well, in my opinion. So what kind of stone is it, and about how big is it?
it's not that big. It's 7 inches by 4 by 5.5, sort of a block. And you know, it was my first experience at carving stone. I mean, I did sketches and everything. And So the whole thing is a bit block-like. It is soapstone, which is a fairly soft stone, and
Mhm.
it's a stone that I guess a lot of beginners work with. It's not as hard as marble,
Right.
so I mean, and that can be a good thing and a bad thing. Just like with aluminum, it's like it's a little bit more, aluminum a little bit more malleable, but then you make a mistake and you you break something off and
Yeah.
done. You can't just, glue it back on.
Yeah.
So there was that. And my work, a lot of it tends to be um, minimal, sort of minimalist.
Hmm.
There's not a lot of, um, it's not busy. There are not too many different elements because I think it makes a stronger statement to just, it's sort of like, you know, the Nike swoosh. It's just like, it just,
Yes, yeah, it expresses itself. Less is more,
right.
like the architectural theories of the early 20th century, Gropius and others. Now you've really kind of launched me into the art historian mode, but to hopefully prevent myself from going overboard, although I do have one or two questions along those lines. I think we have a very nice photograph of you working on this piece.
Yes, that's what it started out with. It's a block of soapstone, and there I'm chipping away at the corners. So I was just starting out on the piece with that, and you can see the soapstone is it's a light sort of gray.
Mhm.
And the way I got it darkened is just at the end, just finishing it, rubbing it with mineral oil.
Oh, and so there's nothing that's darkened it except the mineral oil. And will that darkness uh, remain more or less as we see it today in the future?
It will tend to lighten through age, and then you just can continue to just put mineral oil on it, and then
Okay.
just
Do you think
mineral.
that darkness was that intentional that you chose that material and that you want it to be viewed in that dark state?
Yes, absolutely. So I that was absolutely intentional. I wanted it, it's just like a shadow. It's a figure in the shadows. It's
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
it's dark. It's also conveys the feeling of dark.
Yes.
Um,
It seems very suitable, appropriate for the message or the thought that you're trying to convey. Now that I have to launch into art historian mode because I always think of this every time I see an impressive female sculptor. And Michelangelo, worked primarily in stone, primarily in marble. He is still, I think, universally regarded as one of the masters of stone in all, certainly Western art. But he had, I don't remember the circumstance of him making the statement, but he said that women were incapable of working in stone. And the easy answer to that, or the excuse for him saying it, is the physical strength that's required. But he did also elaborate to the point that women couldn't think on the scale and of the significance of thought that was necessary to create work in stone. So I just threw that in because I think even in your very small piece, you put the lie to that mistaken idea. So congratulations.
Right. Well, there's also, art historian, um, uh, Camille Claudel, who was Rodin's assistant,
Yes.
just, really basically, yes, women have long
Yep.
not been given any kind of credibility as artists,
Uh,
for years. I mean, it was always considered only men do this and only men
yes.
do this. And they take,
Yeah.
and Rodin took a lot of credit for a lot of Claudel's work.
Even work that was purely hers, except for a few final touches that he might or might not have added. Yeah. Have you been to the Rodin Museum then in Paris?
No, I have not.
Oh,
Not
y-
yet.
it,
I was in Paris in a long time.
well, if you get there again, and I hope you will, you must go because they give quite a bit of attention to her work and their partnership, if you will. And her work is extremely beautiful and accomplished. So it's anyway, it's worth making a trip if you're interested in Rodin and sculpture and women who have been overlooked. It's just it's a resonating experience that I think of whenever I'm in a conversation like this. And that let me just sort of ask one, roll it up into one simple question because we have a couple of interesting slides that we still want to look at. Um, when I look at your work, and even as we're talking now, I think of artists like Rodin, like Degas, and more importantly, I think in some ways Alberto Giacometti.
Mhm.
Do you must be on some level to some degree familiar with their work in sculpture. Do you ever, we talked about this earlier, but I just want to ask one more time. Do you ever think in advance of creating a piece of artists like those? Your work has parallels and similarities that are quite strong to my eye and experience, but I just want to clarify how you work mentally, shall we say.
Um, no, I've never, I never consider working in the style of, or, doing other people's work. Most of everything really just sort of comes out of my head. My
Yeah,
kids always ask me like, where do you get these ideas? And it's what comes.
I know exactly what you mean, and I just feel that um, that is the essence of art. It's not something you can study, you can memorize, you can travel, you can it comes out of your inner being, and you can't plan for it. I don't know. I don't understand how people who sort of go to the studio every day and seem to have fresh ideas. But a friend of mine who's a multimedia artist said, "Well, if I'm having a bad day, I just remind myself if you rub two sticks together, you'll create fire." The way
Yeah.
she expressed it. And I guess it works for her. And I think about that when I'm having a tough time. So maybe it'll help you in the future. But so let's look at that interesting other picture that you shared with us of the work in process, not this pour. We'll come at this one.
Okay, so this just shows how I created the work, for people who are not familiar with casting. All my work, I basically take part in the whole casting process. So I first created the work, and you'll see on the left, that's the work that's in Interwoven Worlds, Facial Identity. And I created it in foundry wax. So first I do a mold, that's, a mold of my face and hands. And I
Mhm.
I made a silicone mold, which is reusable, but I pour the hard wax in there, and then there are sprues and cups attached because the metal is poured into that cup part and then goes through the channels. And then on the upper right hand of the screen, you'll see what it looks like. You create a ceramic shell, which is you dip it in what's called a slurry, this solution, and sand, and you do like 8 layers of this. I'm simplifying it not to bore you with the process. So that creates a ceramic shell, which is then fired in a kiln, and the wax is melted out. So the hollow part, everything that was wax, becomes metal. And then in the lower right-hand corner, you'll see this is after the pour, the what it looks like. And then I have to cut off the sprues and the cup, those little channels in the cup. And you'll see all the ceramic shell that remains that has to be chipped away. Casting is very labor intensive process, a long process. And because there are not always these opportunities to pour, the foundry work I've been involved with myself, with a bunch of colleagues, I usually get together with them and we pour metal with somebody who has a furnace. And so I tend to prepare a lot of pieces all at once.
Right. That's pretty typical for the reasons you've just explained. And so this is great to have this image because not everybody who's going to see this video is going to know about that process and technical physical challenges. I just want to clarify one thing for any potential viewers. The sprues, that's a technical term that refers to those on the upper left as you view. There's 3 dark pieces. They look like arms on the centerpiece, and it looks like a walking stick or something on the one on the far left. They're hollow tubes that allow the air to escape in the process. Correct me if I'm wrong, Esperanza.
So actually what they are you make them in wax and then they're hollowed out when the wax is poured out. But
Yeah.
basically you have to see those pieces, they're flipped over. So the metal poured into the cup. And when they come out the tubes, you know that it's gone all the way to the bottom.
Right. But you break those tubes off unless you want them to be part of the finished piece.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, well, I'm really enjoying our conversation, and I think that because of the nature of the show, for one thing, and because you have such an interesting background, I do want to include a very brief discussion of that, because it seems to me that there must be some effect on your current work with your very interesting past life, if you will. So let's go to that very last image, just as sort of a point of reference. The last image of you in the pour.
Right.
There you go. Just quickly tell us where you are and what is happening here, and then we'll go on to just a brief sort of introduction to your previous very interesting life. Okay.
Well, I wanted to point out that not a lot of, as you talked about it historically, not a lot of women do cast metal. And what's interesting about this pour crew is we're mostly women. This pour was done just last month out in Thurmont at the Catoctin Furnace.
Oh.
It was for the Maryland Iron Festival. So we're actually pouring iron in this. But I just wanted to show also, it's again the end of the process, where you have to a lot of heavy equipment, and particularly for iron, which is very heavy, we heat that up to 3,000 degrees. Aluminum's more like 2,000. Bronze is a little bit higher than aluminum, less than iron. And again, the heaviness and the strength of the metal has a lot to do with the temperature that we're pouring it at, but we're wearing a lot of protective gear. And, again, there are not a lot of women because the ladle, what we call the ladle, which is sort of like the big bucket of molten metal, it could weigh 100 pounds. And put it this way, I weigh 100 pounds. I'll usually take the job of what I'm doing here, which is a skimmer, which is just making sure the slag doesn't pour in as the people on the poor ends in. So again, I'm sorry, that's a little technical, but I did want to tie that in with the fact that there aren't a lot of women now who do metal, who do pour it, and all the cast metal work that I have produced, I've never worked with a commercial foundry. I've always been very hands-on, doing all the work myself, including with the pour.
That's unusual. Even acclaimed sculptors throughout history have often relied on, studio assistants and other workers to support their work. So, if let me just get back, if I can, to actually see your face, because yeah, there we go. Very quickly, I'll just tell the listeners what I learned in looking at your website. You have a very extensive career as an administrator in the arts, and what I found even more fascinating, and perhaps, and I'm going to ask you this directly in just a moment, you are a medal-winning international fencer, correct?
Yes. Well, I fence for the US when I fence internationally.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So let's start there because I think that's the most relevant, and then we'll just maybe touch on your administrative experiences. Does that experience as a fencer, the control and awareness you have to have of your own body and your opponent's body, do you think that's influencing your sculpture in any way?
My sculpture is very much influenced by, my well, before I was a fencer, I danced professionally for over 20 years. And so when I was younger, I couldn't decide between being a ballerina and a brain surgeon. I was always interested in that mind-body connection. And
Hmm.
and so as a dancer, there is that. And then when I quit dancing, I took up fencing because the body, I have to move. And yeah, it's the physicality of it. And that's also another thing, another reason why I was attracted to sculpture, because there's a sort of physicality of the sculpture. It's
Right.
not the physical doing of it, but also the themes that I express, what I call being human, have a lot to do with expressions of the body. So my work is not necessarily all figurative. I mean, it's more representational of
Hmm.
concepts and ideas. But again, that comes from, yes,
Yeah.
the
Well,
physical nature.
sculpture is a physical art, no matter what medium you use, because at least I would say that it is, because it's not just the physicality that's perhaps the process itself of creation, but it's a physical object that you create that occupies space and engages space. It's just it's fundamental. It can't be separated out from that fact. So, well, Esperanza, it's been really fascinating talking with you. I wish we had a little more time, but we do need to be time sensitive because of the compact nature of these talks so that we can get them out before the show's over and encourage people to come and actually see your work for themselves. So I'm afraid we're going to have to overlook your fascinating administrative career. But I don't think you'll really mind that, will you?
It's fine. Yeah.
Well, all right. I can tell from your tone of voice that could you at least tell us why you made a change from an administrative sort of office managerial career into things like dance and the arts in general?
Well, actually, I started out as a dancer, and
Huh?
when the dancing days were nearing the end, the body starts to say, "Mm-mm." um,
Right.
I I went back to school. I got my master's degree in public communication, and went into arts administration. So I was executive director of Loudon Symphony for a number of years before I went over to academia and became the manager of the School of Music at Shepherd University. So it's at Shepherd University that I started taking courses because I worked there, and that was one of the benefits of working for a university is you could take all these courses. And I just started sculpture. I was always interested in sculpture, and just fell in love with it. And again, part of the reason why I work in metal is because that was one of the things that was available to us. Not every university college program has foundry facilities.
Yeah, it's an expensive proposition to create and to maintain. I know that as an academic.
Right. So that's how I got into the metal sculpture. But again, it was through that administration. But going back to why I did that, because I had been a dancer for so many years, and also I had worked as a photographer and graphic designer as well. So that sort of combined all the visual
Sure.
elements.
It seems like a much more natural flow when you explain it than when you
Right.
just read it on paper.
Sure. Yeah. Like, how did it go from here to here?
Yeah,
And just going into arts administration is just the way of giving back to the arts, to promoting the
sure,
arts,
sure.
um, and all the arts. My particular interest was classical music. So I actually landed the job with Loudon Symphony. Interestingly enough, my master's thesis was on Baltimore Symphony Orchestra's
Wow. Yeah,
marketing and
yeah,
promotion.
yeah.
And it was like when they hired me, it was like, their board, like at the interview, that they actually read my thesis. Like, who reads somebody's master's thesis?
Exactly. Yeah, well,
They
that
thought, "Oh, this is really interesting. This is really good."
yeah,
But anyway, that's how I got a little bit into arts administration, and then switching over to academia was kind of a natural thing. I mean, I also teach. I continue to teach ballet. I have a teaching diploma from the Royal Academy of Dance, and I besides just being administrating arts and giving back to the arts, I love to teach,
yeah.
and and again,
Well,
it's just giving back to
you've
your
had
art.
a very well-rounded, accomplished, and interesting life, and I hope that our conversation and looking at your work uh, today will encourage people to come and see your work in the show, which is up, I guess, for most of this month and the rest of June and most of July. But I hope people will watch us and find your work interesting enough that they'll want to come to the show and see it and the other wonderful pieces that are there. So, Esperanza, thanks for taking the time to talk with me today. And Marissa, thanks for your technical support. So, Esperanza, I hope I'll see you in the galleries.